I can assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Try and channel it to
You will see a procession of games
deny what they think is false argument. Free and uncorrupted communication.
Constance Penley. I'm Professor of Film Studies and the co-director of the Center for Film, Television, and New Media. The other co-director is right here, Ron Rice, who is who had to run out of the room for some reason, who is the Arthur N. Roop Professor of the Social Effects of Mass Communication in the #1 ranked UCSB Department of Communication. The center is a product of two divisions, the Humanities and Fine Arts, whose dean is David Marshall, and the Social Sciences, where Melvin Oliver is dean. But the affiliate faculty for the Center for Film, Television, and New Media are drawn from almost every department and every division and school on the campus. This is anyone who is doing media or media-based research. So welcome to all of you to our fourth lecture in the year-long series called Media Ownership, Research, and Regulation. I especially welcome the students in my freshman seminar here on the front row, who have been, for the last 5 weeks, reading Robert McChesney's most recent book, The Problem of the Media, U.S. Communication Politics in the 21st Century. The series, the year-long series on media ownership, has been organized by the Center for Film, Television, and New Media and is wonderfully supported by the Roop Chair Endowment, the Critical Issues in America grant of the College of Letters and Science, the Department of Communication, the Department of Film Studies, the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. And for this lecture today, for Robert McChesney's lecture, we also received support from the Walter H. Capps Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life. And we always receive a great deal of support from Chancellor Henry Yang. And we are very pleased to be able to welcome Representative Lois Capps to be with us today to hear about this very important topic. The primary goals of the Media Ownership, Research, and Regulation series are to raise awareness about the critical issue of media ownership, to provide venues for debates and discussion from multiple perspectives. This includes researchers, the public, policymakers, legislators, media industry producers, and people from the news media. And a goal, especially relevant to us as an academic institution, is to identify, define, disseminate a core set of concepts. What is it that we all need to know to understand, to be able to analyze all the positions out there on media ownership? Now, I'm sure that many, if not most of you, are here because you feel there is something of a crisis of the U.S. media, which is marked by a decline in hard news, the blurring of the line between news gathering and entertainment, staff cuts and concentration of ownership, increasing conformity of viewpoint and suppression of genuine debate. You're also probably concerned about the lack of transparency in how our media policy gets made. Robert McChesney's earlier book, Rich Media, Poor Democracy, was hailed as a pioneering analysis of the way in which media have come to serve the interests of corporate profit rather than enlightenment and debate. Bill Moyers, who is going to be here on March 1st, speaking at UCSB, this is what he said of Rich Media, Poor Democracy. If Thomas Paine were around, he would have written this book. If Paul Revere were here, he would have spread the word. Thank God we have in Robert McChesney, he goes on, they're equal in his love of liberty and his passion to reclaim it from the media giants who treat the conversation of democracy as their private property. The problem of the media extends and enriches the arguments made in Rich Media, Poor Democracy by going back to show that our current media system was not arrived at naturally, but resulted from a series of decisions about all of our communication systems, from the Postal Service through telegraphy, radio, television, and now the internet. Decisions usually made behind closed doors with heavy industry lobbying. But then McChesney goes forward and offers a strong note of hope in his riveting account of the public campaign to oppose the relaxation of media ownership rules in 2003. Now, as a result of and through that campaign, McChesney co-founded the media reform group Free Press, which is now a key clearinghouse for news about media policy and media reform, now a serious NGO, non-governmental organization. It's linked to every other such group in the country and is the interface with the National Conference on Media Reform, the second one of which will be held in St. Louis, May 13th to 15th. Now, I was very fortunate to be able to go to the first National Conference on Media Reform that was in Madison, and it certainly proved the adage, if you build it, they will come. I think close to 2,000 people showed up. It was just phenomenal. Now, before I finish this very brief introduction of this key leader in media reform, whose proposals are based on the most meticulous historical scholarship, let me mention very briefly some future events in the media ownership series, and you can always go to our website to learn more. On March 3rd, Jennifer Holt will be here from USC to lecture on new paradigms in global entertainment economics, or her alternate title, The Companies That Ate Hollywood. On May 7th, we have a panel of America's top news editors who will discuss the issue of media ownership and media bias. The panel consists of Bill Keller, executive editor of the New York Times, Lionel Barber, U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times, and Jacob Weisberg of Slate, which has just been bought by the Washington Post. The panel, and it's kind of an unprecedented, I don't think these people, these high-level people have ever been together to address this topic in this way. The panel was organized by Ann-Louise Bardak, director of the Media Project of the Center for Film, Television, and New Media. She will co-moderate the panel with Virginia Postrel, who's a former editor of Reason and writes a monthly column on economics for the New York Times. On May 21, we'll have the culmination of our year of activities with a conference that brings together scholars, policymakers, media industry producers, and it's also very much an event for the public. We're going to be holding it downtown in Victoria Hall. I can't resist leading into Robert McChesney's lecture with this great description of him from Danny Schechter, who is the author of Weapons of Mass Deception. As Chomsky is to linguistics, Ben and Jerry's to ice cream, and Elvis to shaking one's hips, McChesney is to media analysis. He is the king. There is no one more definitive. Please join me in welcoming Bob McChesney.
Well, thank you, Connie, for that very warm and gracious introduction. And I should say, before I go on, that the reason I'm here today is because of Constance Penley. When we did the first conference on media reform in Madison in November of 2003, we didn't want it to be an academic conference. So we said, we're not inviting any academics. You know, we wanted just people who were serious about trying to change this system, who were political activists. Then, being an academic myself, I said, well, I would be able to go to my own conference. So I said, we better revisit that theory. So we had decided of one conference where I invited a few academics to talk about the role academics could play in movements to democratize our media system. And we only invited, I think, 3 or 4 academics to that. And then I thought, this is going to be an interesting test to see here, a conference on media. and the crisis on media in our society and in the world, how many academics who study this might actually want to come to this on their own? How many would actually make the trip at their own expense to come if they weren't being paid for, they weren't going to get a hot tub, they weren't going to get a limo, they were just going to have to go in and just be like everyone else, the other 2,000 people at the conference? You know, there are literally thousands of faculty in this country who do nothing but study some form of media or communication and work with these issues. So, and lots who study politics. So you see what the sum total of people who will do that. I regret to tell you, the sum total can be answered on two hands, including the faculty in Madison, Wisconsin, in which it was held. But of that small number who did come, one of them was Constance Penley. And it was very striking to me that she would come across the country for that, attend it, be a strong participant. And I travel very little. In fact, I only travel 2 or 3 times a year because I have small children. But the only trips I'm doing are to people like Constance who've shown me they're serious about this, that they're not just in it to like horse around, but they're very serious about these issues, and they're committed to them in a very fundamental way. So thank you, Constance, for asking me to be here. And I want to thank you all for this turnout, which I find amazing. If we had a day like this in Urbana, Illinois, at any time of year, we would not get this turnout. And I guess people are telling me this is a really lousy day here. That accounts for the turnout. It reminds me of the first time I came to Southern California for my very first academic conference, in fact, at the University of Southern California. I lived in Seattle at the time, and I'd lived in Seattle for quite some time. This is 1986. And it was one of these graduate student mini-conferences, and those of you who are graduate students are familiar with these things, so they herd together a bunch of PhD students to perform for the professors. And this was my first one. And so I go to this thing, and I'm from Seattle again, and I'm marked down there. It's February in LA, and it's brilliant sunny skies, 70 degrees every day. And so I'm like the only one from Seattle there. Everyone else is from California or Arizona. So every time we'd walk out of Southern Cal, I'd walk outside and go, man, what an incredible day it is today. What's going on here? And people sort of looked at me, didn't say anything. Then finally, the third day, when I said that for the 14th time, this guy pulled me aside and said, hey, Bob, it's like that all the time here. We know about the weather. You know, you don't have to tell us about it. So I understand this is a really crappy day, and that accounts for this turnout. So thank you all for coming. Well, yeah, as Constance said, and as I think we all know, we have a very serious crisis in the United States today. And it's not a media crisis. I mean, it's a crisis of self-governance, and ultimately it's a crisis of the survival of our species. Not to be too dramatic, but those are the stakes we're talking about. But it's certainly the survival of accountable, viable self-governance, and I think that's in deep crisis in this country today. And what we're seeing with the decline of viable, accountable self-governance is what always emerges with that, is a clear indicator of that crisis, is corruption. Political, social corruption at the highest levels, which now I think our entire media, or our entire political culture is drenched in and immersed in severe corruption. And our media are central to understanding the crisis and the nature of the crisis, and creating and perpetuating the crisis. Now, they're not solely responsible, they only participate in it, but they are a cornerstone factor in understanding the political crisis in the United States today. And any effort to right the ship in this country has to right the ship of media. There's no other way around it. They must go hand in hand. And I'll give a couple of examples. I mean, the two most important things media systems do in free societies, in democracies, in electoral democracies at least, are to help people participate in two sets of decisions. One is the decision to go to war. I mean, there's no more important decision a government makes is to kill people or get people killed, to throw people's lives at risk. And the second is coverage of elections, how we select people to have power, political power, or replace them and monitor them. I mean, that's really where the rubber hits the road on a free press. You know, if you flunk those two, it doesn't matter if you get the weather right or the scores right for the ball game. If you're 0 for 2 there, it doesn't matter. You got to go 2 for 2 there, or you don't have a free press. You don't have a free society. Well, I'm not going to tell you what the batting average is, but it's below the Mendoza line, for those of you who are baseball fans. Consider the decision to go to war. Consider the decision to go to war for a second. In the past century, since the United States has become a global power, We've engaged in I don't know how many foreign wars exactly, scores. Most of the quickie carpet bomb variety we don't even hear about. But 7 or 8 major foreign wars that involve troops going overseas, significant encounters from the Spanish-American War to World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Central America Wars, and now the 2 Iraq Wars, Gulf Wars. And the legacy, if we look at the record since 1898, since the Spanish-American War, of the U.S. entrance into these wars and the press coverage is not a very impressive one. These are the dark pages in U.S. media history. When we teach journalism, these are the chapters we're sort of ashamed of. We quickly page through those chapters to get to Watergate or coverage of some other impressive area. And the reason's very simple. In virtually every major foreign war the United States has fought since 1898, the government in power in the White House at the time of the war was being launched wanted to go to war. It desperately wanted to go to war, but it didn't believe the people of the country wanted to go to war. That was sort of the problem it faced. So it had a couple of choices. Do we tell the truth to the people and then try to make our case and convince them to go to war and hopefully win the argument? Or do we lie and try to deceive them to support the war? Well, regrettably, guess which one they've opted for pretty much every time? Plan B, lie. And that's where the press comes in. The role of the press then, of course, is to sort of monitor that, check them, call them on it, not let them get away with it. And regrettably, our historical track record has been unimpressive in that area. In case after case, from World War I, even to World War II with Franklin Roosevelt, but there was probably better coverage there than in any of the other wars. Certainly Vietnam, where we now know with the Pentagon Papers and the more recent releases of the LBJ diaries, the blatant lying that was done to try to get us to support a war that even the leaders at the time knew was fruitless and hopeless. And they knew if they told the truth to the American people would never support the war. In all these cases, our press sadly regurgitated what was said by people in power, oftentimes, as we see today, as we're about to get to, with disastrous effects for the people in this country and elsewhere. So that's the legacy that journalists know about. I mean, actually, you're educated that in a good journalism school. This is the dark side. So the thinking would be, you would think, the next time the government comes along and says, hey, we got a war for you, you reach for your wallet. So, okay, slow down, partner. Let's see some really good evidence before we get people killed. Let's, don't just wave the flag in my head at 100 miles an hour. In fact, the more the guy waves the flag, the more you're sure it's BS behind it, right? I mean, that's just obvious. That's the historical record. That's what you should know. So along comes the Iraq War, and I don't have to tell you all this. This part of the lecture, any of you could stand up and give. You know what happened. A series of outrageous claims to justify intervention. I wouldn't say preposterous, outlandish, bizarre at the time they were made, now entirely discredited to justify an invasion of Iraq, which clearly and indisputably violated international law, but that's something we're not supposed to really be talking about. And our press coverage was atrocious. And not just some local yokel weekly newspaper someplace, not just some right-wing talk news channel, but the very height of the most prestigious journalism in this country, the New York Times, the Washington Post, participated in this dreadful journalism, which basically had the United States go to war in Iraq. And I think it's striking, and it says a great deal about the nature of journalism in the United States today, that just at the exact same time, the New York Times had a reporter and much of their staff propagating the idea that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, which were an imminent threat to the American people. Another reporter in the New York Times was summarily fired and out of disgrace for doctoring stories, making up quotes, making up people, because he was too lazy to go out to do his job. He wanted to sit in his hot tub, so he just mailed in some baloney stories, largely on trivial matters. That reporter's name is Jason Blair. Run out of the profession, now a disgrace. His name will live in infamy, like Quisling's name in Norway. Judith Miller, the reporter who wrote those pieces which basically funneled government propaganda from Chalabi about weapons of mass destruction, still is employed by the New York Times. You will still see her byline. She still appears as an expert talking head on cable television news. But I'll tell you this, when Judith Miller and Jason Blair both go to meet their makers, Judith Miller is going to have a lot more to answer for than Jason Blair. So our war coverage has not learned anything from the past. If anything, it's gotten worse. And the reason why I say it's gotten worse is that in Vietnam, it would be more understandable and justifiable for a reporter to get it wrong, because the climate they were in was not only not conducive, there wasn't access to alternative information as much as there is now. When Judith Miller was covering this story, all she had to do was look at press from any other country, talk to reporters from England or France or Germany, just go on the web and Google WMD, and she would have found plenty of evidence to say, hey, maybe I ought to ask them a few more questions before we run this story. The New York Times could have done that. They have no rationale. They have no justification for their conduct. And keep that in mind since then, because regrettably, we've had a series of events in Iraq, starting with remember the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue? And that was the people have risen up in Iraq to welcome us, and they've overthrown the statue, which was an orchestrated media event. And then there was the famous Mission Accomplished, remember that one on the boat? I guess that was San Diego, where he's out there flying around in his leather jacket. And then they caught Saddam Hussein in the hole in the ground, or whatever that was. And then all these are played up in our press as if there's absolutely no memory of every previous story. This finally settles it. We've won. The people have embraced us. Through now to this most recent election, which was played up, again, not just in the Fox News channel, but in the New York Times, in Newsweek, in our leading media, on NPR, in PBS, as this triumphant march of democracy. An election in which most people didn't even know who they were voting for. It was the most bizarre election I've ever heard of, in which our leading journalists actually pontificated and argued that there was 60, 70, 80% voter turnout, when in fact the observers that could make any credible assessment of that weren't even in the country. They couldn't enter the country. It was so dangerous. In fact, they were funneling to us what the press releases and the government information officers were saying, precisely the mistakes they should have learned from earlier. It hasn't gotten better. It's only gotten worse, and we continue to pay the price for it. Now, as for election coverage, here too, our news media, this is a rich subject, and I'm only going to make a few points. I'm going to go through it quickly. But I think it's important to understand that despite the upturn in voting in the 2004 presidential election, and there was an upturn in voting compared to previous years, in general, the voting rate in the United States tends to be abysmally low for a free society. And unacceptably low compared to most of our peer democracies. And it's a situation in which voting in the United States is, do you know what the number one indicator is for whether someone votes? Their income. It's very much class-based in the United States. So, for example, there was a big uptick in 18 to 24-year-old voting in the 2004 election over the 2000 election, a report just showed, but it was almost entirely in the top third, income-wise, of students, college kids who did the increase in voting. Poor people don't vote in this country. They tend not to vote. As one Harvard political scientist said, the working class basically doesn't vote in the United States, or much of it doesn't vote. Poor people don't vote. Some people say, well, those dumb people, why aren't they voting? Well, I would argue if you look at how our system works, it's absolutely rational. It's utterly rational behavior not to vote because of the corruption of our electoral system and the role the media plays in perpetuating that corruption. And what is the corruption of the system? We'll start with the fact that very few electoral races are contested in this country anymore. I come from Illinois. We have 21 House of Representative districts. None of them were contested because of gerrymandering, not one. We had a Senate seat that was up for grabs last fall. Barack Obama won the seat. The opponent he ran against wasn't even from our state. His name was Alan Keyes. I mean, this guy, it was about as competitive a race as Stalin's re-election was to the Politburo in 1936. I mean, there's no reason to vote for the House or Senate in our state. Basically, that's how it is in state after state. Most races simply aren't being contested. So gerrymandering wipes it out. And then those races that are contested, you see the role of big money coming in. That is just, our system is so drenched in money now that they don't talk about it anymore because everyone's drenched in money. Democrats, Republicans, just swimming in billions and billions of dollars that pay for these presidential races. And where does the money come from? Well, overwhelmingly, not surprisingly, it comes from people with money, the well-to-do. Over 80% of individual campaign contributions come from the wealthiest 1/4% of Americans. Over 80% of the money come from the wealthiest 1/4% of Americans. That's where the money comes from. And where does the money go? And this is where it becomes a very important media issue. Where does the money go? Well, the more closely contested a race is, the more likely the money is to go for paid television advertising. Paid television advertising, that's where the money goes. What do we think of that? Well, we've seen an increase in spending on TV ads for candidates of roughly 40% every 4 years, going back to the 1980s. It just keeps going up, enormous amounts of money. And I know in California, if I understand it, you people have been periodically just pummeled, carpet bombed with TV political ads, depending if you have close races in the state, which make media companies spectacularly wealthy. But what about the nutritional content of these ads? Let's face it. In fact, there was a guy, Robert Spiro, famous advertising executive. He's the head of creative for Ogilvy and Mather, one of the leading advertising agencies in the world. And this is back in the 70s. And Robert Spiro, he would go to parties and people would criticize TV political ads for candidates. And they'd say, it's just like beer advertising. And Robert Spiro, being an ad man, got really upset because he thought beer advertising had dignity compared to political ads. So what he did is he took a year off from his job as the leading advertising guy in New York City, and he did a content analysis of every single TV presidential political ad from 1952 to 1980. Every single one. He went to the DuPont or whatever the library is that catalogs all these things. And he said that if any of those ads was held to the same standards commercial ads were by the Federal Trade Commission, none of them would be allowed on the air. They all violated elementary Free Trade Commission standards for advertising. And he wrote a book called The Duping of the American Voter, where he went through each ad and showed you. And his whole job was dealing with the FTC. So that's what we know about the caliber of those ads, how reliable they are, how acceptable they are. They obviously promote cynicism, and that's much of their function is to promote cynicism, to get people not to vote for the opponent. Understand that in a race with your political ads, it's very different than a commercial ad. Coke doesn't have a lot of incentive to run a lot of ads saying Pepsi's terrible. They don't, Coke really doesn't benefit if they run a bunch of ads saying the people who work on the Pepsi assembly line urinate in the bottles when no one's looking. Because if people don't buy Pepsi, it doesn't help them. It only helps them when people buy Coke. Not true with candidates. If you get someone not to vote for your opponent, you win, even if they don't vote for you. If they stay at home, you win. That's a different logic than the commercial marketplace, and that's the logic we see in these ads. It promotes a cynicism and a depoliticization. It enhances tendencies already in our society. And what we see from our television media, the place where we get so many of these ads placed, is their response has been, with the increase in the amount of TV advertising, is to pretty much zero out their candidate coverage. There's virtually no coverage of candidates on television anymore. So on one hand, lots of ads. This is the lingua franca of our political culture now. On the other hand, virtually no journalism. And what print journalism we have that covers candidates, print journalism, incredibly, is all too often just monitoring ad campaigns and getting response to ads. And tragically, the print coverage we get, even in our best media, like the New York Times, say, for example, or the Los Angeles Times, our best political coverage of ad campaigns is not whether they're telling the truth, but whether they're effective. So the issue isn't whether they're lying through their teeth in the Swift boat ads, for example, but whether people believe them, whether they're affecting the polls. That's the news story there. All in all, it's an extraordinarily decrepit picture. And understand that a free press would counteract that. A free press would say, we're going to discredit these ads. A free press would say, we're going to promote the candidates that don't have a lot of money, that can't afford to run a lot of ads, and see what they have to say. A free press would try to do everything it could to roll back these anti-democratic tendencies. Instead, our press system does the exact opposite. It rides that wave right into shore and into its bank account, and we pay the price for it. And then third and finally, one other limitation of our press system I want to talk about before I go into the politics of it. And this is something that often gets lost in the shuffle. It's one of these long-term tendencies that I think might be the single most striking problem with our media system today. But like suburban sprawl or environmental degradation, it doesn't have a news hook, so it doesn't get quite the attention it should. And that's what I like to call hyper-commercialism, which is the sort of commercial colonization of every aspect of our media or media culture. The traditional barrier between editorial and commercial, church and state, that distinction, that here's the advertising commercial part that pays for it, and here's the editorial or creative part that it pays for, that's being wiped out. Increasingly, they're merging with commercial values dominating in a way that really was difficult to imagine not too long ago. I find this process morally corrosive of public life. It means everything's for sale, and the purpose of communication is basically to sell. Sell, sell, sell. If truth no longer matters, what matters is if you convince people to buy whatever you're selling, and that's the proof of truth in a commercial culture. And understand, too, if you understand how hyper-commercialism is built into this profit-driven system and the way it works with concentrated media ownership, vulgarity, a popular issue to speak about with media today, is the logical result of a concentrated hyper-commercial system. You know, you don't hear complaints about vulgarity very often on the local community station. It's commercial values that drive the most grotesque forms of vulgarity. They go hand in hand. Isn't it ironic that our most right-wing media company, News Corporation, with its Fox News channel, is also our most vulgar media company, with Fox Television Network? I mean, that's not a coincidence. The two go hand in hand, although it is indeed ironic. So why do we have these problems? Why do we have hyper-commercialism, dreadful journalism? Well, some people would say, well, that's an error. That's not the way the system's supposed to work. In fact, I would argue that's exactly how the system's supposed to work. The system is working perfectly. That's the problem. The system is flawed. The problem with our media system is not that we have bad journalists. I think our journalists are as good as we've ever had in this country. It's not that we have bad creative talent. It's as good as we've ever had. It's not even that we have bad owners. The owners are largely irrelevant. If Rupert Murdoch were to move to Utah and change his name and buy a bong and just sort of grow his hair, and just leave, News Corporation would keep doing the same thing. Same thing with Disney or Time Warner. The CEOs are following cues. They're doing what's rational for them to do. And if I were a shareholder in one of these companies, I'd probably want them to do the exact same things. That's how the system works. It's not bad people, but it's a bad system. And then the question says, well, where's the system come from? That then becomes the crucial question. And this is really, I think, where it gets interesting, because we're told, I was in my crib, my father's leaning over and telling me this. We're told this is the natural system, that God wanted it this way, or the founding fathers, or Adam Smith, someone way back then said it had to be this way, right? Not so at all. In fact, any rigorous look at our history, and it doesn't even have to be especially rigorous, shows that that's not true at all. There's nothing natural about it. It's not a free market system. We'll talk about that one in a second. In fact, our media system is built entirely on government policies and subsidies and monopoly licenses and franchises. All our largest media companies are the recipients of enormous government largesse. The system couldn't exist without it. It couldn't exist without it. Radio and TV monopoly licenses, government granted and protected monopoly privileges at no charge. Massive gift to these companies. Cable and satellite franchises. Once again, monopoly licenses to spectrum or to franchises of enormous value. Copyright, which is nothing more than a government-created and enforced monopoly to prevent competitive markets. Created and enforced monopoly to protect copy content providers. A huge subsidy by the public to private media interests. These firms could barely exist without them, so they're so important. And here's the surprise. You're saying, oh boy, this guy's just against these subsidies. He's a free marketer. Well, I'll let you know, I'm not a free marketer, in case you were wondering. But these aren't necessarily a bad thing. I'm not opposed to subsidies. In fact, I think policies and subsidies are unavoidable in a press system. Even if you wanted a free market system, even if you got the editor of Reason magazine here and stood up and said, I want free market media, you'd have to have a lot of policies to create a free market system. It wouldn't happen naturally. The media system doesn't organically happen as a free market. In fact, nothing of the kind. It's all built on policies. It's unavoidable. And the question is, who are the policies going to be made for? How are they going to be made, and whose interests are they going to be made? And I think that's really where you see the heart of it. How are the policies that build our system, that allocated our radio and TV licenses, built up our cable systems, built the ownership rules, established the copyright regulations, how are these policies developed? And here I think it gets sort of interesting. Now, this is a prominent film school and the #1 communications department in the country, I've learned today. Congratulations. So I'll use a film example to explain how media policy making is done in the United States. Because media policymaking in this country is extraordinarily corrupt, as Dr. Penley said in the introduction. Most of you, until quite recently, would never have heard of crucial decisions that are routinely made, allocating tens of billions, even hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment over time in markets, in core industries, in communication and telecommunication. It's just done behind closed doors. And then you're told later on it's a free market, when one company's got all these cable systems. That's generated by free market, when in fact it was almost always done by government decisions behind closed doors. And the way to understand how the media policymaking process has worked in the United States in recent decades is if you think about the great Hollywood film from 1974, The Godfather, Godfather 2, excuse me, yeah, the Academy Award-winning film. And there's a wonderful scene about halfway through that film in Havana, and it's 1958. And Hyman Roth is having his 67th birthday party. And Hyman Roth is there, he's an American gangster, and Michael Corleone's there. All the American gangsters at Hyman Roth's 67th birthday party in a patio overlooking Havana. And what Hyman Roth is doing is he's dividing up all his holdings in Havana among all the gangsters. So they're going to split up, they run the island, and they're basically dividing up Havana amongst themselves. And as he does this, so we get the hint, he gives them a slice of his birthday cake, which has an outline of Cuba on it. So everyone's getting a slice of Cuba. As he says, like, Louis from Chicago, you get the casinos there. Frankie from Philadelphia, you get the prostitutes, you know, dividing up the island. And that's basically how media policy has been done in this country. Very powerful lobbies meeting behind closed doors, dividing up a cake with the United States on it or the globe, getting the good deals. Now understand, though, it's not a conspiracy at all. Just like if you know the plot of The Godfather 2 was the fight between Michael Corleone and Hyman Roth to get the best part of the deal, so it is that these guys are fighting amongst themselves, these big corporate lobbies, to get the biggest slice of the cake too. The reason why these companies have such huge lobbies is not because they're concerned about us, it's because they're concerned about each other, because they're fighting each other for the best part of the deal. But what they all agree on is it's their system. It's their system. And then when they get the benefits of these deals, they're going to hire public relations people to tell us it's a free market. That's how the system works. Just like when Hyman Roth, when he announced as he was dividing up the country among his gangster friends, he said, "Isn't it great to be in a country with a government that respects private enterprise?" That is exactly how the situation works here. And my argument's very simple. What we need to do is to change this. We have to popularize these debates, draw public attention to them, bring informed public involvement, and we'll get a whole different set of policies, I'd argue. And I don't know what exactly those policies would be, but I know the more democratic involvement there is, the more public participation, the better they'll be. That much I do know for sure. They can't get worse. They can't get worse. To give an example of the sort of policy that would never survive any public scrutiny, look what's happened to radio broadcasting in the United States in the last decade. In 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act. And 2 paragraphs were inserted into that law by the National Association of Broadcasters. They were written by the lobbyists themselves. They were never debated in a committee hearing, never debated on the floor, never discussed. And what those 2 paragraphs did is they ended the cap on the number of radio stations a single company could own nationally, and up to 8 in a single market. Changing what had been decades of very strict ownership limits that allowed there to be lots of local radio station ownership in this country in highly competitive local radio markets. Ending it with 2 paragraphs, undebated, undiscussed, written by the NAB. Since 1996, commercial radio broadcasting in this country has been basically destroyed. We've seen companies like Clear Channel come along now owning well over 1,000 stations. Most markets, I don't know what Santa Barbara's situation is, but I suspect there are 2 or 3 companies that are maxed out or close to max out, dominate the radio situation. We're seeing they're doing what's perfectly rational for them to do in such concentrated markets. They jack up the advertising, there's more commercialism, they pipe in robot disc jockeys, have syndicated fares, strip out as much localism as possible. That's rational behavior for them. But there's nothing about the free market about that. That's corrupt policymaking that allows that to happen. If we had a policy, 1 station per owner, that wouldn't happen. You'd still have a competitive market. You'd still have a free market. You'd have a much more freer market. This is corrupt policymaking, not capitalism per se, that produces it. It's capitalism per quo, a very corrupt crony capitalism in this instance. And if there were any public involvement in this policy debate over radio, that would never exist. Even John McCain, even Michael Powell, believe it or not, the head of the FCC, has said there's too much concentration in radio. It hasn't quite worked out the way they thought it would. Of course, he said we aren't going to do anything about it, heaven forbid. But even it's impossible not to acknowledge that, given how dreadful radio broadcasting has become in the United States in the past 9 years. So, in my view, the task is to popularize debates, have more public involvement, and I think what we would find over time if we had that take place is the type of media system we would gravitate to would be one with much more competitive markets, far more local ownership, and a much larger, vibrant, diverse, nonprofit and non-commercial sector. I think that is clearly the direction we would end up in if we had those debates. But I'll tell you what, if we have those debates and the American people study the matter, discuss it, say, no, we want to let a few companies own everything. We want to be carpet bombed with ads. We don't like journalism. We love political ads. If that was the response of the American people, I'd live with it. I believe in democracy. I said, fair enough. I gave it my best shot. Didn't work. Regrettably, that attitude is not shared by the media corporations. They're not especially excited about having that debate. I think they somehow suspect they might not win if we got in on the debate. If we got on the patio in Havana and tried to get a slice of the cake, they might not get as big a slice. I think that's their concern. And that's our job. That's our task. They have enormous lobbies. They have very sympathetic, generally non-existent press coverage of their issue. And they're also protected by 4 huge myths that keep them well entrenched in power and basically make it so it's more difficult for us to imagine the ability to change the system. And any effort to reform and democratize our media policymaking, our media system, has to really confront these 4 myths and confront them directly. And I try to do that in my work. And let me just quickly talk about them now. I can't do it in detail. A couple of these myths deserve, chapters, if not books, to do appropriately. But just so you know what the myths are, I suspect you've heard of 1 or 2 of these at least. The first great myth that protects the sort of concentrated commercial media system in the United States is that, like it or not, hyper-commercialism, all that stuff, lousy journalism, this is the system intended by the founders. The First Amendment says basically rich people get to make as much money as they want from media, and that's the way it is. If you don't like it, too bad. That's what the First Amendment's here for. Move to another country, or maybe another planet. But basically, that's what the First Amendment's all about. Rich people can make as much money as they want, and the government can't do anything about it. That's the purpose of the First Amendment. Now, that's a crude interpretation of the First Amendment, but regrettably, it's a popular one, especially the farther up the social pecking order you get in the media system. It is also entire nonsense. It is patent nonsense. If you go back and study the period of the crafting of the First Amendment, the Constitution, the formation of this republic, it's what's striking about it is how important press issues were to our founders, especially Madison and Jefferson, who wrote at length about them. They were deeply concerned about the importance of having a free press for having a free society. This was not something they added on at the end. After they had 4 beers and it's closing time, oh yeah, let's get something about the press in there. No, this was something they wrote about a lot, they thought about a lot. They understood you couldn't have a free society without a viable press system. And at no time, under any circumstances, did any person in this country, and certainly not anyone who crafted our Constitution or any member of Congress, ever say, for the first 75 years of this, or 100 years of this country's history, freedom of the press means just let some rich guys make as much money as they want and we'll let the chips fall where they may. No one thought in those terms. That was unthinkable in the first 100 years of this country's history. It was unthinkable. In fact, what we find is that the founders of this country and the first generations of this republic instituted a series of major policies and subsidies to spawn a free press the market would have never developed. The most important of these, and I'm just going to give one, was the postal subsidy. The post office was by far the largest federal body when it was created. It was in the Constitution. And when 70% of the traffic of the post office was newspapers in the 1790s. It was over 90% by the 1830s. The role of the post office basically was the circulation arm of our newspaper system. And it was the second most important cost after printing to publishing a newspaper is what you had to pay for postage, for distribution. So a crucial question the founders had to face in 1792 when they set up the post office, as they were required to by the Constitution, is what are you going to charge newspapers to be mailed? Now today, of course, we'd expect that there would have been the equivalent of Newt Gingrich of that era, standing up, waving a copy of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, slamming his fist on the table and say, these guys have to pay full freight. Come on, this is America. No free lunch for these deadbeats, right? That's what you'd expect. In fact, the range of debate in 1792 on what to charge newspapers to be distributed in the mails extended from one radical position, which was that newspapers should be heavily subsidized. In the interest of democracy, and to spawn papers, to heavily subsidize them with a far greatly reduced postage rate, to encourage the distribution of newspapers. That was one extreme position. The other extreme position, James Madison's position, was that all newspapers at all times should always be sent for free. Any charge at all would be a form of censorship against dissident ideas, because the papers that most needed the subsidy are the ones on the border, probably the most dissident papers. That was the range of debate. Now this side won, but for the next 75 years, a public debate in Congress routinely was on efforts by these people to see that subsidy ended. And in fact, the abolitionists made it a pet cause, because their papers were the ones that needed the subsidy the most. And they won by the 1840s, so they got it so that weekly newspapers were sent for free in their own community. The poorest, weakest newspapers, the abolitionist papers, got free distribution in their county. They got that by the 1840s. So it was a political issue, it was a political debate. And it was a successful debate. It's actually something we should be proud of. And I think increasingly now we're seeing historians are looking at this aspect of American history and say, this is actually one of the really impressive parts of our history. What we did that distinguishes us from the other countries of the world, how we build a free press. When Tocqueville came here in the 1830s, he wrote at length about the print culture in this country. How many more newspapers and books per person there were here than in Britain or France or Canada. The striking difference. The immersion in print culture and the democratization it had, especially in the northern United States. Well, it wasn't an accident. It was the result of policies and subsidies that created it, enlightened policies and enlightened subsidies made in enlightened political debate. So that's the real tradition. That's the real constitutional tradition freedom of the press has in this country. And as Hugo Black, perhaps the greatest of our Supreme Court justices in First Amendment issues, put it in 1945, the First Amendment doesn't just prevent government control over media, it prevents concentrated corporate control. It does not countenance private domination of media either. Freedom of the press is not a right just for those who own it. It's a right for all of us to a rich, diverse press system. So if we don't have it, we can't have a free society. It's elementary. And that's the honest tradition we go forward with, not the one that the media barons give us. The second big myth that we have to deal with is the idea that professional standards in journalism will protect us from concentrated ownership, from hyper-commercialism, from bias, from cronyism. This is a complex issue, and in the book that Professor Penley is requiring her students to read, I spent 2 full chapters discussing this issue. It's so important. And let me just make a couple comments about professionalism. It's a relatively recent development in American journalism history. The first 100 to 120 years of American history, our journalism was stridently partisan. In 1892, for example, if you picked up a newspaper, it would be a Republican or Democrat or some branch of Republican or Democrat or some other political party. And if you were to read a Democratic newspaper in the 1892 presidential race, it would be likely that they wouldn't even mention the Republican at all. They'd only mention the Democrat. They wouldn't even mention the opponent. I mean, there was no pretense about fairness. Now, the system was actually, you say, oh, that's horrible. Gosh, that's terrible. Well, maybe not, because the system worked differently through much of the 19th century. It was a much more competitive market. A city like St. Louis would have 10 or 15 daily newspapers at any time. A full range of political, not the full range, but a significant range of political opinion. And it was easy enough, the capital costs were so low, it wasn't that hard to start the 16th paper if you didn't like any of the first 15. By the end of the 19th century, that pretty much ended. Newspaper economics, driven significantly because of the importance of advertising, had come to assume as a source of revenue, made it virtually impossible to start new newspapers in existing markets. And we saw the number of newspapers shrink down to 1 or 2 in most communities in the country. Then having stridently partisan journalism, where you had basically the politics of the owner pontificated on the front page, smelled like month-old fish out on the table, because you couldn't have an alternative viewpoint. It was just that viewpoint. And that was the great crisis of journalism in this country in the late Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And it was the crisis that spawned professional journalism as the solution. Professional journalism basically said, okay, we're going to have a concentrated press ownership, we're non-competitive markets, only 1 person or 2 people, 2 companies will control the newspapers in a town. But they won't use that power, that market power, to dominate the news. They'll have trained professionals will be responsible for the news. If you read a newspaper, you won't know if it's owned by a Republican, a Democrat, or a vegetarian. It'll be irrelevant because there'll be trained professionals doing it. Now, in a lot of my work, and in fact almost all my work, I criticize the weaknesses of professional journalism as it's developed in the United States. I don't have time really to do that now. The one that's most striking, but not the only one, is that its reliance upon official sources is the basis of what's legitimate news. And at its worst, as we see in coverage of war, it means basically a regurgitation of what people in power debate. And that's nothing that was new to professional journalism. That did not exist pre-professional journalism, where newspapers just regurgitated what people in power said. That was a new development. And it emerged for a number of reasons, not the least of which it's politically very safe, it doesn't get you in hot water, and it's cheap and easy to do. It's inexpensive journalism to just basically report what people in power say. But also, it's not inherent to professionalism. Professional journalism doesn't have to be that way. It's not like the choice is either stridently partisan journalism or weak professional journalism that regurgitates what people in power say. In this country in the 1930s, there was a strong movement by our leading journalists of that era, Haywood Broun, George Seldes, to challenge that. Say, no, professional journalism should basically not just regurgitate what people in power say, it should challenge what everyone says. It should see itself as a democratic force serving democratic values to the broad population against everyone in power. I mean, it should be interrogating everyone. I won't keep you in suspense, they didn't win that fight. But they were the people who founded the Newspaper Guild, the Union of Print Journalists, which still exists to this day, and that was in their charter. That was sort of journalism they would fight for at that time. They understood the importance of winning the battle of the newsroom. They were not happy with the sort of journalism that did ultimately develop. And so keep that in mind. Professionalism doesn't necessarily mean the type of journalism we have today has to be what professionalism necessarily gives us. Professional journalism probably hit its peak in the United States from the 50s to the 70s. That's sort of the golden age, culminating in Watergate coverage. And since then, it's been under severe attack. Since the 1970s, the autonomy journalists were able to develop by the 1970s has been under attack, and really from two vantage points. First, and most importantly, commercial attack. Increasingly, the big media companies have been able to gobble up newspaper chains and television networks, have seen doing journalism as bad business. It costs a lot of money, it doesn't bring a lot of money in, and in the markets soon, it's easier and easier to slough off on the journalism. So we've seen much less hard news, much less expensive news, investigative news. We barely even have local television news in this country anymore. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the group in Denver, Colorado a few years ago, the Rocky Mountain Media Watch. Some of you who are media fanatics are probably familiar with this group if you've been working on this issue. They did a content analysis of all the local TV news on the Denver TV stations for like a 4-day period, every single, or maybe it was a week. But they went through every Denver TV station. Like I said, they did an analysis of every news story, and then they broke it down, and I put it together, and and it was pathetic. It was like the lead story one night was like a donkey getting a shampoo. The sort of stuff you get in local TV news. And so they went to the Federal Trade Commission and they sued, and they said that these stations should not be allowed to call this news. That it was false advertising. It was misbranding. They had to call it some other name. And the point they were making is that there is barely any journalism on television anymore, which is the primary source of local news. Most of our radio journalism basically ceased to exist in all but a couple of markets, and then it's basically reading the morning paper, and most print journalism has suffered too. One example of just the decrepit situation of journalism in the last 20 or 25 years, the collapse of professional autonomy, is the collapse in journalist morale. If you talk to Linda Foley, the president of the Newspaper Guild, she says the number one issue that concerns her memberships, way beyond salary, is the commercial encroachment on their work, the inability to do the work they got into the profession to do. Howard Gardner, a Harvard psychologist, finished a multi-year study of all the leading professions in the United States with 2 of his colleagues. It was published in 1992. And in the chapter of journalism, where he talked about what's been happening in journalism, he said you could characterize a majority of working journalists in the United States as being clinically depressed because of commercial pressures they feel on their jobs. The other blade of the scissors that have attacked professionalism has come from the right-wing attack on journalism, the disciplining to keep forcing journalism to move to the right, to develop a strong double standard. So what George W. Bush does is treated differently than what John Kerry or Bill Clinton would do on issue after issue. And that's a subject for a full talk, and maybe we'll get into that in the Q&A, but I'll skip that now. But that's the other blade that has produced the situation where we're at today, where we basically have very little journalism left in this country to speak of. The third great myth that protects media power in this country is the idea that, no matter what, even with concentrated markets, any way you slice it, the media system gives the people what they want. This especially is true for entertainment. They don't make this argument for journalism as much. But, I think I was probably, at my earliest age, one of my first memories is hearing my father tell me that one too. The media system gives you what you want. The moral of the story, the argument is, so shut up. If you don't like what the media system does, don't blame the system, blame the morons who are demanding it. So if you want to change the system, change the morons. Don't change the system. The system is sort of a dependent variable. The media bosses will gladly give you whatever you want if you demand it. And so if morons want to watch dumb shows, the media bosses will give dumb shows. Now, it makes a certain amount of sense if you think about it. Television studios, movie companies, they're out to make as much money as possible. They're competitive. They clearly don't want to put out TV shows people don't want to watch. They clearly don't want to produce movies people don't want to buy tickets to watch. So at a certain point, it makes perfect sense. Competitive pressures compel these firms to give the people, in fact, what they want. But upon closer inspection, this argument is deeply, deeply flawed and self-serving and even circular. For one thing, for markets to give people what they want in basic economics, they have to be competitive markets. They have to be markets where if you're dissatisfied with what the choices are, new people can enter the markets to give you new choices. That's what a competitive market is. There are no barriers to entry. That's a monopolistic or oligopolistic market. Media markets, by definition, almost all of them are oligopolistic or semi-monopolistic. They're not competitive. And as economists will tell you, that means you don't have consumer sovereignty, you have producer sovereignty. They give you what you want, but within the range of what makes them the most money. And they've got a lot of control over that. They've got a lot of control over that. And then it becomes a very complex relationship because they give you what they can make the most money off of, and you develop a taste for it. And then you start demanding it. It's a complex relationship. Demand doesn't just create supply. To a certain extent, supply creates demand. And if you're never exposed to something, of course, you'll never demand it. You can't. It's a complex relationship. The best example of how this process works, and this, again, is appropriate for, given the being at the film school or film studies here, is with foreign films in the United States. In the early 1970s, roughly, I don't know, correct me if you know the figures, Constance, 10% of all films shown in American theaters were foreign language films in the early to mid 1970s, 10%. By the mid 1980s, it was down to 2 or 3 or 4%. By the late 1990s, it was down to less than 1/4% of 1%, and then it fluctuates if there's one hot movie or periodically, but it's basically down at rock bottom since then. Now, by the give the people what you want theory, you would expect that sometime starting in the late 1970s, American people stood up en masse, slammed their fist on the table and said, get those foreign films out of our movie theaters. We're not going near that theater till that foreign stuff's out of there. And give us what we want or we're not going back, right? That's what you would expect. In fact, it wasn't demand creating supply, it was supply creating demand. Because what happened was, starting in the mid-1970s, was that you saw the rise of the multiplex, the multi-screen theater, which basically drove the single-screen theaters out of business. And instead you had, in community after community, multi-screen theaters where you had one projectionist could handle all the screens, one popcorn maker, one ticket person. So a single-screen theater couldn't survive. So all the foreign films had come in with a network of theaters that serviced nothing but foreign films. And I'm sure Santa Barbara had its share. Seattle, where I lived in the 1970s, I think we had 7, 8, 9 foreign language theaters just in Seattle. New York City, Manhattan in 1975 had 25 theaters that showed nothing but foreign language films in Manhattan and New York City. Well, all these theaters basically found it harder and harder to survive cost-wise in this new multi-screen environment. And producers of foreign films, when they came to the United States, increasingly found they had to go to these chains to get their films shown. And the chains were, it's a little different ballgame. Suddenly they had to compete with Hollywood films to get screen space. They had to guarantee to do so much TV advertising, oftentimes more than the cost of the film, to lock in a spot on the screen. And some of the films fell away, gradually just eroded, and people stopped showing their films. Now, I have students. I remember I've had students in classes in past years when I've been talking about films and foreign films, and they'd look at me in amazement and say, "You mean they make movies in France?" Because well, you laugh, but where would they know that? Where would they know that? Tell me where they would learn about that. And when they go into the video rental store, they just whiz right by that row, if there is a row. They probably don't even know what that stuff is. And go because they've never been exposed to it. The point I'm making is that culture, media is a complex relationship of supply and demand. I mean, it's not a simplistic, vulgar one. And the idea that markets give the people what they want is not meant to shed light on it, but to rather disguise what's actually going on. Similarly, a problem with markets, and a core problem, is they generate what economists call externalities. The classic one we all know is pollution. A company makes a product, pollutes the air, someone buys the product at a price for what it costs, say, to make it, and the producer's happy, the consumer's happy, but there's all this pollution in the air that society has to pay for. But it's not factored into the market relationship. That's why it's called an externality. So there's nothing in the market relationship that will eliminate the pollution. It'll just get worse and worse. It requires policy intervention to force those two sides to take that cost into consideration, so they have to pay for the cost of that pollution. That's what an externality is. Well, media have enormous externalities. The hyper-commercialism, the effect that has on all of us, especially what it's doing to our children, that's an enormous externality. Terrible journalism, so we don't know what the heck's going on. That produces enormous externalities in terms of the corruption and poor governance that we're going to have, and the growth and inequality in our society. There's no way around it. We need media policies to address these externalities, to minimize them, and actually there are sometimes positive externalities, to emphasize those. Then finally, the last of the great myths that I want to mention is the idea that technology will set us free. There is no need to worry about the media giants. There's no reason to worry about hyper-commercialism. There's no reason to worry about the lack of journalism. The internet will set us free. All we need is our blog and our mouse and our handheld camera, and we'll live happily ever after. We're in the midst of an extraordinary communication technological revolution, and indeed much is changing. But I think it's clear the idea that the technology alone will allow us to avoid the difficult political fights and policy fights to develop a democratic media system is simply preposterous. There's no historic evidence nor contemporary evidence to support this argument. And I talk again about this at length in the book. Let me just mention 2 points that are worth considering on this. First of all, even if everyone's got a website, now I've got a website, it sucks. It does. I hope no one goes to it. I haven't updated it in a year and a half. I'm too busy and I don't have any money. It's a lousy website. I wish I could take it down. It's embarrassingly bad. But so all of us probably could have websites like that. Is that a good media system? I don't think so. It takes resources to do good media. A healthy media system has the resources to do journalism. If I'm working in a coal mine all day, come home, make dinner, do the laundry, make lunch for my kids the next day, fold the laundry, then sit down to give my analysis of North Korea, it's going to suck. That's not going to do it. We have to have people who actually know Korean, who know the issues, to have a viable press system. The technology in and of itself won't generate that. And what we've learned is the commercial system has shown us already in the last 12 years, they haven't been, with the rise of the internet, it hasn't allowed new commercial players to challenge the existing media giants. Not one viable commercial content player has come via the internet, although much promises by the media giants that they would get new competition have been made and continue to be made despite the lack of any evidence for such claims. So we have to think creatively about policies if we were to use these technologies to make them actually serve us better if we want to be serious about it. And also, we shouldn't abandon the fact that it's absolutely corrupt to allow the big media giants to get these enormous subsidies. Why should they get them? Why should they get billions of dollars of subsidies? And we should just go off and have our website and email 10 people, while they get billions and billions of dollars of subsidies or other privileges. It's simply not correct. But most importantly, let me give you an example of where policy is so critical, even to making these technologies do what they're capable of doing. As I suspect some of you are familiar, there's wireless internet, you all know about that. But with new mesh technology, there's a chance to have wireless internet access across this country. We're very close to the point where what we could have in this country, not very difficult, what we could have in this country is a situation where you could have broadband wireless internet access anywhere in this country as a public utility, basically for free. There'd be a cost, but you wouldn't have to pay it individually. It'd be a public utility. It would be much higher bandwidth up and down. The uplink would be as wide as the downlink. The more people who use it, the stronger the system, the less expensive it is. Much higher quality, open to everyone automatically, just built into every computer, every device. It's just a public utility. We could do that. The cost would be extraordinarily low, prorated across the population of 280 million people. We have the ability to do that. And in a rational society where there weren't vested interests, that's exactly what we'd do. 3 or 4 years from now, that would be the system we'd all have in this country, and soon the whole world. That would be the system we would have. And the cost would be, a few $1 billion a year spent, but if that, probably lower, maybe $10 per person in the country annually for that system. And that would basically have all your telephone would be done on that, all electronic communication would be on that broadband wireless system. There's one reason why that might not happen, one crucial reason. Hyman Roth and Michael Corleone, the phone companies and the cable companies, because their whole survival is premised on us not having that option, that they have the 2 wires that you have to go through to get broadband internet access in business in your homes. That's what they're built based on. And they're doing everything in their power with policies to make sure you don't even know about what I just told you about, and that it's never even imagined, you can't see it. And this is a great fight that's going on at the policy front right now in this country. And there are a few crucial areas where the fight's going on. Some of you might have heard about what happened in Pennsylvania last December. Philadelphia passed a law in the city council where they're going to set up one of these wireless networks in the city of Philadelphia, make it a public utility, great wireless mesh system, everyone have access to it. What a great thing to do in a city like Philadelphia. To make it, you talk about the digital divide, well, that's it, it's history, it's over. It's just over. Imagine what that does for commerce if you're into free markets. All the businesses that can take advantage of this, that drastically lower their communications costs. Think of all the wonderful things of that. Well, it just so happens Michael Corleone and Hyman Roth, Verizon and Comcast are based in Pennsylvania. And they happen to have a certain amount of influence with the governor of Pennsylvania. And they went to the state legislature in Pennsylvania and got a law passed. I couldn't write this stuff. This wouldn't even make it in Hollywood. They got a law passed in the state legislature that any community in Pennsylvania that wants to set up its own wireless system for its citizens has to get the approval of either Verizon or Comcast. Has to get their approval to do it. Can you believe this? And the governor signed it. The governor signed it. But that's because they understand they're cooked if people have a real competitive alternative. They can see this system in action. They can't survive. No one's going to pay $60 a month for that crappy cable wire or DSL or whatever you're going to pay with all the added on cost. If you can have a really great, much stronger system with a faster uplink as a public utility without any strings attached. And in state after state now, this is a fight we're having to prevent them. Unfortunately, the state governments are fighting with us to prevent the cable companies and the phone companies from making it impossible to have competitive systems, wireless systems owned by the communities, nonprofit, non-commercial utilities. There are other fights too in Washington to make this happen. We need contiguous spectrum, because it works on a spread spectrum. I don't want to go into the technology here, but it's not dedicated lines. It's in a much more rational, effective use of spectrum than currently is used by the old antiquated system. But we need contiguous spectrum for the system to work. Oh, it's out there. We can get it. It's actually, we probably will win that fight because they can't stop us because there's enough spectrum. There's plenty of spectrum. And then finally, we have to do something about copyright. Copyright laws in this country are probably the most corrupt laws of any of our media laws of all. They've been done by the most powerful lobbies behind the thickest steel doors. We've seen copyright provisions extended way beyond what could be defended by the original and proper intent of copyright, which was to promote and protect producers, but also promote and protect the public domain, which has now been eliminated in copyright law entirely, the public domain. Nothing new has entered the public domain since the 1920s, thanks to the routine extensions that are made to copyright law. Copyright law now stands as a barrier to a free and open internet. It's an enormous, electrified, 1,000-foot high barbed wire. And that's policy, that's pure policy, and that's a fight we have to win. So the point I'm making is the technologies can do wonderful things, but not if we just let Michael Corleone and Hyman Roth determine how to deploy them, or their politicians. We have to enter, we have to fight, we have to organize. Now, until about 2 years ago when I gave this talk, and I didn't give the exact same talk, but a version of this talk, until about 2 years ago when I give this talk, it was always a very hypothetical talk. I felt like, a nuclear physicist explaining, how an atom bomb would work if you did all these things. it seemed impossible. Who could possibly challenge the media? They get, people are content. The lobby's super powerful. They own all the politicians. It's hopeless. And then Bush comes into office in 2001, and we talk about politicians being in the pocket of industry. I mean, this guy's in the underpants of industry. This is hopeless. I mean, can't possibly change this system. That's what it seems like. Then history does one of those wonderful things. In 2003, the Federal Communications Commission embarked upon its review of media ownership rules with the stated goal of eliminating the rules that limited the number of these monopoly radio and TV licenses a single company could have, and eliminated the ability of companies to gobble up as many as they want and then use their profits to gobble up all the other media in the community, cable systems, newspapers, and the like. It would have basically, if they had their way, eliminated local media ownership in most countries, cities in this country, would have given us one-horse towns, one newsroom. You can imagine what one stole newsroom all alone in the community, what sort of news the competitive pressures are going to give you there. If you think it's bad now, it can get worse. Think of what happened to radio between the early 90s and today. It can get worse. And everyone, when the FCC announced, since 3 of the 5 members are Republicans and led by Michael Powell, a name that will go in infamy in the public service hall of shame, it looked like a slam dunk. I wrote a piece, I think, in The Nation or in these times with my friend John Nichols saying, it's done, there's nothing we can do. You looked at everything seemed hopeless, and it was just go on and see what happens next. And then those wonderful things happened. 2-3 million Americans rose up across the political spectrum, left and right, especially left, and sent letters, emails, phone calls in, organized hearings around the country, raised holy hell, and stopped them. Just stopped them in their tracks. And we stopped those rules changes. And I think it empowered people in a way on this issue that hadn't been seen in this country in 75 years. Because what happens is as soon as people understand the media system isn't natural, it's not something you have to, the system is like a mountain range. It's there for 80 million years. But in fact, it's something that's created in your name, but without your informed consent. And it's doing terrible things to you because it suits their interest, not yours. Once people understand that, it's like a light goes on, like the switch is clicked. Nothing will ever be the same again. So we aren't going to put up with this anymore. And that's what happened. And that's the period we're in now. And we're seeing a dramatic change. I remember in January 2003, I was at a Senate hearing on media ownership in the Senate Commerce Committee, and a Republican senator, his name's John Ensign from Nevada. Is anyone here from Nevada? Oh, you're lucky. If you remember The Godfather 2, remember they had that senator from Nevada? Some of my best friends are Italian Americans. That guy? Well, this guy Ensign's sort of a dead ringer for him, at least at the ethical level. And so he's a popular guy with the National Association of Broadcasters. But Ensign stood up at this committee hearing that I attended, and Ensign goes, I'll have you know that in all my time in public life, I've never heard any of my constituents show any concern with this media stuff. This is not an issue anyone cares about. I think he was probably telling the truth in January 2003. I really think Ensign was laying it on the line. He probably had never heard that. But what I can tell you now is there's not a single member of Congress who has not heard about it, and heard about it repeatedly, and hearing about it to this day with organizing going on. We've seen a fundamental shift. In following the 2004 election, Move On, the group I suspect many of you are familiar with, and another group, True Majority, each did polls of their memberships, the people they work with. What are the most important issues in the coming generation we have to work on in this country? Where should we put our resources, Move On said. True Majority said, where should we put our attention and resources? Number 2 on each of their lists was media reform, ahead of the environment, ahead of the war in Iraq. Number 2 for each group. There is an increasing recognition that this is an issue. If we don't work on this and organize on it, all the other issues won't get anywhere, won't amount to a hill of beans. It doesn't mean you put all your energy into this issue, but it means you make this part of your organizing work, part of your political work if you care about democracy. It has to be. One other indication of how quickly this movement is growing is the group that I helped form, Free Press, with John Nichols, just 2 years ago now, amazingly. We started with one guy sort of sleeping on the floor in Northampton, Massachusetts. Today we've got 16 full-time organizers and activists in the country working on about 40 different issues that cover the whole gamut at freepress.net. Much of the stuff I've talked about tonight and a number of other issues. The exciting thing about media reform politics, and the thing to keep in mind, is that it's not like campaign finance reform. And I suspect some of you, being good citizens you are, have worked on campaign finance reform or thought about it or helped movements to try to clean up the electoral system. The problem there, as you probably know, is that in campaign finance reform, you have to put all your chips in one number. If you don't get fully publicly funded elections or something off like that, you have any crack at all, the money's going to drive right through it and destroy the logic and spirit of your reform. That's why the entire campaign finance community is so totally despondent and suicidal right now. They seem like there's no what can we do. It's just hopeless. They don't hear talk about money in politics anymore. That whole community's given up. They just think it's hopeless. Because they passed McCain-Feingold, it's worthless. Absolutely worthless, right? Look at the money that went into the last election. Not so with media reform. What we've discovered with media reform is that you can win tangible victories and they can't be taken away. There are going to be several hundred new low-power FM radio stations in this country this year and next year as a result of activism on the open parts of the FM dial. And they're going to really exist. You're going to really hear them. They won't be taken away. And that's due to organizing. That's due to activism. You can win tangible things. And the most exciting thing is you can win stuff at the local level. And one of the great secrets, and I don't know what Santa Barbara's cable system is, but one of the great secrets of our media system is that all these cable companies get franchises with municipal governments. They get monopoly rights, and they're supposed to do all sorts of good stuff for the people in the community. But of course, they only do it if they're forced to. If a community organizes, they always win. The cable companies make so much money, they always concede and they'll give in what they have to do by law. But if no one forces them to do it, they have these fancy lawyers, they come in, they blow the councilman out of the water, they get their way, they don't do anything. So some communities where they organize, like Grand Rapids, Michigan, Asheville, North Carolina, Chicago, Illinois, Burlington, Vermont, have spectacular public access channels with lots of resources because they get what they're allowed to get by law. And they organize them. When the hearings come up, they force their city councils to make sure these companies give them what they're entitled to. If we organize, we can win those things. You always win, but you got to organize. And they're not going to send you a notice, hey, come on down and organize. That's not how it works. You got to do it yourself. And that's what Free Press does. We try to help communities get together to organize. You want to get Amy Goodman on your cable system? Organize. You can get it. You want to get all those, there's some great TV stations that can be carried on cable systems now. If you organize, you can get them. But you have to organize. The struggle is only going to get more intense. The fight, I think, is picking up steam. We're going to see a number of crucial battles, public battles, in the coming months. I hope you will go to freepress.net, join our movement, stay tuned to it, get on our mailing list. The most important fight in the near term that will be publicized will be the replacement for Michael Powell. He's announced he's retiring or resigning. A lot of people, poor Michael Powell, I've kicked him around a lot. He is a disgraceful person. But I think we have to have a lot of sympathy for him. And let me say this for Michael Powell. He came to the FCC and he said, hey, here's this cushy job where you go in, no one knows who you are, you get no press coverage, you just dole out the goodies to these corporations. You do it for 4 years. When you're done, you get a job for $1 million a year working as a lobbyist or some for one of these corporations or trade associations. Or, it's just a cushy deal. William Kennard, Powell's predecessor, Clinton's head of the FCC, makes $1 million a year for the Carlyle Group, brokering telecom deals, capitalizing upon his knowledge of how the FCC works. And Michael Powell said, hey, this is a good gig. Let me in for this. Then he sort of gets hit with this tsunami of public interest suddenly, and he's totally caught blindsided. And I don't know how anyone else would have handled it in that situation. So that's where my sympathy comes from. But now that he's leaving, we're going to make sure that everyone else, we're not going back to the Kennard system. We're going ahead. Everyone who wants that position from now on, the public's going to know about them. We think when someone goes to run the FCC or join the FCC, the most powerful federal agency by far, because unlike the FTC or the SEC, it actually gives out licenses, monopoly licenses worth billions of dollars. It actually controls spectacular wealth. It builds industries. That person should be subject to public review, like a Supreme Court appointment. That's how it is in Britain and in other countries. These people are serious cabinet members. They're debated. That's how it's going to be in this country. Early indications are, surprise, surprise, the Bush administration is basically, soliciting opinions from the corporate lobbyists about who they want to have appointed to the FCC. But we're going to be there. We're going to organize, and we're going to let this person know that we're watching them, not just us at Free Press, not just the people in this room, but literally millions of Americans. And I hope you'll join us in that fight and everything else. Thank you very much.
My name is Larry Martinez. I teach a course called Cyberspace Citizenship at Cal State University Long Beach. And one of the aspects of the course is to develop the skills and knowledge necessary to be a full participant in the governance of cyberspace. And one mystery that still is out there that I think that maybe your fifth myth could encompass, which is we don't need media literacy in the schools because the public will take care of that themselves. And I was wondering if you could address the lack of media literacy in the curriculum of our public schools. And
thank you for raising that. That's a crucial issue. And media literacy actually is one of the crucial policy fights you win at the local level. That's a school board fight or statewide fight to train people to be critical of media, to understand it, and to produce it, which is crucial. And let me give you an example about that. The Knight Foundation, which is this enormous mainstream foundation, did a survey that was published about 2 weeks ago. Some of you might have seen it. It got quite a bit of attention that showed there's been a serious drop-off among teenagers in the United States today in their respect for the Bill of Rights, especially for the First Amendment. So we saw that. And yeah, it's depressing. That a lot of Americans say, yeah, if someone has a dissident opinion, the government should be allowed to lock them up. So it wasn't really a nice piece, but the conclusion they drew, and I think this is where it gets to what you're saying, is a significant factor there's been this massive drop-off in student media in the past 25 years. That's one of the first things that's been cut in all these cuts. So we have less high school newspapers, magazines, radio, so people don't do media, and media then becomes an abstract thing you consume rather than something you produce. So I think we need media literacy, but we also need lots of student media. We have to make people producers, and that's one of our fights, both student media and media literacy. I think they're crucial local fights. I think we've got to once students actually do media and have to deal with administration, they respect the liberties we take for granted. Yes?
You talk so fast that I just wanted to ask a really simple question. What is the website that you talk about all this stuff?
I'm a fast talker. I apologize for that. It's www.freepress.net. Freepress.net. Thank you for asking that.
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to do a brief introduction of my little group, which is part of the groundswell, I suppose, of your reform. It's the LA Sound Posse at lasoundposse.org. And I will glad to, and it was mostly the introduction I wanted to do. I think you've covered a lot of the internet and alternative media. Do you really have hopes for all of us to make that kind of difference? We're a very small group, for instance, and there are a lot of us, I guess other groups forming around the country, but we're committed to the anti-copyright notion that you've done, explained so well. I guess...
So this is a true-false question.
It was mostly the introduction of the LA Sound Posse I wanted to make here.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Incidentally, though, we did actually train a woman to record and edit and send her to North Korea. So we actually have a recording from there.
It's been a few months since the New York Times and the Washington Post did their mea culpas about coverage of the war, pre-war. Any changes or shifts you can see in their coverage? That's one question. The other one is the BBC and the Canadian Broadcasting Company, are they just historical anomalies, no hope for a USBC?
Oh, boy, that's a great question. And that's, anyone who's read my books know that's a subject I spent books on because it's so important to me about public broadcasting. As for the Times and Post, I mean, I read the Times pretty regularly. It has moments. I mean, I'm not going to say that there aren't good stories periodically, but regrettably, and I think the election was a classic case in point. When push comes to shove, when the government puts on the full PR message blitz press, like they did for that election, that this is the greatest thing that ever happened, that's the time we need them to really pull out the skepticism and say, slow down, what sort of election is this? And regrettably, I think they flunked that test when we needed it most. As for public broadcasting, the United States has never had public broadcasting in the international sense of the term, which means a non-profit, non-commercial service aimed at the entire population, doing the full range of programming, not just boring shows and educational shows, but sports and entertainment and music and all sorts of stuff. That's sort of public broadcasting at its best in other countries, not just in the English-speaking world, but across the world, has done the full range of programming, direct relationship with their viewers and listeners, non-commercial, non-profit. And those services, as a rule, are still very popular, even in multi-channel environments. Germany, Scandinavia, these channels are faring very well. It's surprising. 10 years ago, they were on everyone's obituary list. They're about to go under. So it's been really quite a surprise. Now, the United States never had public broadcasting, primarily because commercial interests were able to steal the airwaves before the public interest ever got a chance. And so when public broadcasting finally was developed formally in the 1960s, the deal was public broadcasters were only supposed to do the shows that no one wanted to watch, that the commercial networks were being chewed out for not doing, the egghead shows. And so the public broadcasters were put in a hopeless situation. They had to do shows no one wanted to watch. So they tried to do a popular show, then the commercial broadcasters would go to Congress and say, why are you subsidizing competition with us? That's not fair. So if they ever do a popular show like Siskel and Ebert, it has to get shifted over to the commercial networks. So it put them in an impossible situation because they couldn't develop a big audience with that approach, and they couldn't then go get a subsidy from Congress. Congress said, why should we give you money? No one watches your lame shows. And so that was a very difficult situation. And I think given that dilemma, they've done as well as they could, but it's meant we've got a very hollowed out public broadcasting system in this country. Now, I will say, and to be fully accurate historically, in the 1960s, the people who started public broadcasting in this country, many of them were visionaries. And they understood they couldn't be like the BBC or CBC or Japanese or Indian public broadcasting and provide that sort of full range. They couldn't do football games and popular music. But they said, let's do the stuff that the commercial networks don't want to do. Let's be edgy. Let's do avant-garde stuff. Let's serve younger people. Let's serve immigrant communities, non-white communities, social movements that feel estranged from the dominant commercial networks at that time. And that was really a lot of the spirit that infused the public broadcasting the first year or two. Well, I don't know, you just think about the calculus there of how that's going to work with the Nixon administration. I mean, that got shot down. I mean, Nixon tried to kill it in the crib after a year or two of that, a couple of years of that. So that vision got killed. That takes a lot of political support to keep something like that supported.
Yeah, what sort of a person do you think would make a reasonable FCC chairman? And how hopeful are you that you'll actually get that kind of person, given that we've had Condoleezza Rice and Alberto Gonzales appointed despite the quite strong opposition to both of them?
We will not get a good person. It's not going to happen. If your goal in this campaign is to get a good person, don't do it. That's not the point. There's no way we're getting a good person. It's a Republican seat. The White House always gets to have a majority, so it's going to be a Republican. And there actually are better Republicans than other, but this guy won't pick one. It's just not going to happen. We're going to raise holy hell, though, just so it stinks so much that it'll be harder for them to do the stuff they want to do. That's the point here. The more hell we raise, the less likely they are to do stuff. The more hell we raise, the less likely the courts are to try to mess with stuff or to do stuff that's bad, too. Courts respond to public pressure, too, believe it. So that's why we're raising hell on this.